There's something really ironic about the fact that one of the most groundbreaking sitcoms in television history became even stronger because people kept trying to stop it from going too far. When you go back and really study the history of All in the Family, you realize the tension wasn't only happening inside the Bunker household. The same arguments exploding between Archie and Mike in that cramped living room were also happening behind the scenes between writers, producers, executives, sponsors, and network censors, who genuinely did not know how much honesty American television could survive. And honestly, I think the censorship battles made the show sharper, more focused, and ultimately more powerful. Because the series constantly had to fight for the right to sound realistic. That struggle shaped everything. You can feel it in the packing, in the awkward pauses, in the way conversations build slowly instead of turning into easy sitcom punchlines. The show almost feels aware that every difficult line had to earn its place on television. Nothing sounds accidental. The emotional tension feels carefully sharpened because the writers knew they were constantly pushing against invisible boundaries. And the amazing thing is that the boundaries themselves became part of the comedy. I always think about those recurring evenings inside the Bunker home where somebody says something that suddenly changes the atmosphere of the room completely. Archie comes home frustrated from work, already irritated by the feeling that America no longer makes sense to him. Tries to keep the evening peaceful because she can sense emotional disaster coming before anyone even sits down properly. Mike and Gloria walk into the room carrying the energy of a younger America shaped by protest movements, civil rights debates, feminism, and anti-war frustration. Then the conversation shifts. Race enters the room. Politics enters the room. Fear enters the room. And suddenly, the sitcom no longer behaves like television was supposed to behave during that era. That's what terrified network executives in the early 1970s. Because before All in the Family, sitcoms generally existed inside safer emotional territory. Families disagreed politely. Serious issues got softened. Networks worried constantly about offending viewers, advertisers, religious groups, political groups, basically everybody. Television wanted comfort. Then this show arrives and starts building entire episodes around arguments most networks previously believed should never happen openly in entertainment. That alone was revolutionary. But what makes the censorship story fascinating is that the restrictions forced the series to become smarter instead of softer. The writers couldn't simply rely on shock value. They had to build emotional realism carefully enough that difficult conversations felt necessary rather than provocative for the sake of provocation. And honestly, that restraint helped the show enormously. Because the comedy doesn't come from random controversy. It comes from recognizable human behavior. Archie Bunker doesn't feel like somebody written purely to offend audiences. He feels emotionally authentic, loud, defensive, proud, ignorant sometimes, frightened constantly by a world changing around him too quickly. The censorship pressure forced the writers to humanize him more deeply because they needed viewers emotionally invested enough to stay engaged through uncomfortable scenes. That complexity became the entire secret of the show. If Archie had been written as a cartoon villain, audiences would reject him too easily. The network probably would have become even more nervous too. But because the series exposes Archie's prejudice while also revealing his insecurity and vulnerability, the conversations feel emotionally real instead of artificially shocking. And that emotional realism made the social commentary much harder to dismiss. I think the censorship battles also shaped the famous living room intensity of the series. Since the show relied so heavily on conversation instead of spectacle, every line mattered. Every pause mattered. Every interruption mattered. The bunker living room became almost like a pressure chamber where language itself carried enormous emotional weight. That's why arguments replaced traditional punchlines so often. The tension becomes the comedy. One character says something awkward or offensive. Another reacts emotionally. Somebody interrupts. Somebody gets defensive, tries softening the atmosphere before everything collapses into full ideological warfare. And audiences laugh partly because the situations feel absurdly familiar, but also because the show constantly dances near lines television previously avoided crossing. That danger gives the comedy energy, especially during the 1970s. America during that era already felt emotionally unstable. Civil rights movements forced difficult conversations about race into everyday life. The Vietnam War shattered generational trust. Feminism challenged traditional domestic structures. Economic anxiety made working-class Americans feel vulnerable and ignored. Families everywhere were already arguing about politics and social change constantly. Television simply hadn't reflected those arguments honestly yet. The censorship battles happened because networks feared viewers might reject that honesty completely. Instead, audiences became obsessed with it. And honestly, I think part of the reason the show connected so deeply is because viewers could sense the tension underneath the production itself. The series feels like it's fighting to exist in real time, fighting against television politeness, fighting against sanitized dialogue, fighting against the idea that sitcoms should protect audiences from discomfort. That struggle becomes part of the viewing experience. You feel the show pushing against limitations constantly. And somehow that made it funnier. Not louder funny, sharper funny. The kind of comedy where silence after a line can become more powerful than the line itself. I always think about how differently All in the Family handles disagreement compared to older sitcoms. Before this series, television families often resolved conflict neatly before the credits rolled. Lessons became obvious. Emotional harmony returned safely. But the censorship pressure forced this show to become more psychologically subtle. The writers couldn't simply turn episodes into direct political speeches. They had to hide emotional complexity inside ordinary conversation. So instead of characters announcing moral lessons clearly, the audience watches tension unfold naturally. Archie reacts defensively because he fears losing relevance in modern America. Mike challenges him aggressively because Mike sees silence as moral weakness. Gloria absorbs emotional damage from both sides because she loves her father while understanding Mike's frustrations. Bunker keeps restoring humanity to conversations threatening to become emotionally poisonous. That emotional layering feels incredibly sophisticated for a network sitcom. And honestly, the censorship battles may have forced the show toward that sophistication. Because when directness becomes dangerous, writers often become more creative emotionally. Another thing I really admire is how the restrictions forced the series to trust audiences more. The writers couldn't always explain every point openly. They had to rely on implication, emotional contradiction, awkward silence, facial reactions, and conversational rhythm. That trust changed television permanently. Audiences suddenly became participants instead of passive consumers. Viewers had to interpret scenes emotionally. They had to decide whether Archie sounded ridiculous or tragic, or both simultaneously. They had to sit inside unresolved discomfort instead of receiving clean moral instructions. That's unusually mature storytelling, especially for early 1970s television. And honestly, the controversies surrounding censorship probably helped the show culturally too, because people became curious about what television was suddenly afraid of. Viewers heard warnings before episodes aired. They heard critics arguing about the content. They heard politicians and religious groups complaining. Then audiences watched and discovered something fascinating. The show didn't feel vulgar for the sake of vulgarity. It felt truthful, messy truthful, painfully truthful sometimes. That difference mattered enormously, because the series proved controversial television could also be emotionally intelligent television. Before this era, networks often assumed controversial content automatically meant cheap sensationalism. All in the Family changed that assumption permanently. The show demonstrated audiences could handle emotional complexity, social conflict, and uncomfortable realism inside comedy. Not only handle it, love it. And honestly, its role became even more important because of the censorship tension, too. In a series filled with ideological conflict and social anxiety, acts almost like emotional oxygen. She softens scenes just enough that audiences keep breathing emotionally through difficult conversations. There are moments where Archie and Mike become so trapped inside political arguments that the room starts feeling genuinely hostile. Then quietly says something sincere or vulnerable that suddenly reminds everybody these are still human beings underneath the conflict. That balance made the show survivable for mainstream audiences. Without, the censorship battles might have won eventually, because the series could have become emotionally exhausting. With, the show maintains warmth even while exploring prejudice, fear, and generational resentment. And the audience laughter became more complicated because of all this tension, too. You can hear nervous laughter constantly throughout the series. Hesitant laughter. Laughter mixed with recognition or embarrassment. Sometimes viewers laugh because Archie sounds absurd. Sometimes because the arguments feel painfully familiar. Sometimes because the room becomes so uncomfortable laughter feels like emotional release. That layered audience reaction changed comedy forever. The censorship pressure unintentionally helped create a new kind of sitcom experience, where discomfort itself became part of the humor. That's revolutionary. And honestly, revisiting the series now makes the censorship fears seem almost surreal sometimes, because modern television became so much more explicit afterward. But context matters. During the early 1970s, network television still treated many social subjects like dangerous territory. Open conversations about racism, sexuality, politics, feminism, religion, and class conflict made executives deeply nervous. All in the Family forced television to evolve by constantly challenging those limits. The fights with CBS became part of the creative process itself. And maybe the most interesting thing is that censorship unintentionally protected the show from becoming preachy. Since the writers constantly had to navigate network concerns carefully, they couldn't simply turn characters into ideological mouthpieces. The emotional realism had to remain central. That's why the series still feels alive now. The arguments sound human first, political second. Archie isn't just representing conservatism. He's representing fear of irrelevance, fear of cultural displacement, fear of losing dignity in a rapidly changing world. Mike isn't just representing progressivism. He's representing generational frustration and moral impatience. Gloria represents emotional exhaustion from living between ideological worlds. Represents compassion, surviving inside social chaos. That emotional complexity exists partly because the show had to fight so carefully for every difficult conversation it included. And honestly, I think the censorship battles gave the series a strange kind of confidence, too. The writers knew they were changing television while they were doing it. You can feel the show discovering new emotional territory in real time. Discovering audiences could survive discomfort. Discovering comedy could hold anger and sadness and fear without collapsing. That creative tension gives the series enormous energy even decades later. Especially when you realize how many modern shows owe their freedom to those battles. Without All in the Family pushing against CBS standards constantly, television probably evolves much more slowly. Networks become less cautious because this show proved audiences wanted honesty more than artificial comfort. That's an incredible legacy for a sitcom built mostly around family arguments in one cramped living room. And honestly, maybe that's the deepest irony of the whole story. The people trying hardest to limit the show unintentionally helped shape the exact qualities that made it unforgettable. The pressure forced sharper writing, more emotional subtlety, more psychological realism, more careful balance between humor and discomfort. The censorship battles didn't weaken the series. They forced it to become smarter. And somewhere inside all those tense meetings between writers and executives, while America itself argued about what television should be allowed to say, one sitcom quietly transformed the entire medium by refusing to stop sounding honest.